to the Web3 Prof Podcast.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm here with Roberto Rios, formerly the Peruvian Bull. Thanks for being with me here today.
Thanks for having me here, sir. It's an honor.
So, sir, I appreciate that. Make me
well,
feel...
the studio is so nice. I feel like I have to, up my game a little bit.
This is official. This is an official thing. Roberto, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into Bitcoin?
Sure. So, actually, I got fudded out of Bitcoin in 2017. I started buying like early that year, and then I read a book called
The Bitcoin Standard?
No, it was about the block size wars and like essentially the failure of, but it was like not called the block size wars, but it was by Eric Townsend, and it was about how like Bitcoin could not be a reserve currency was the conclusion of the book because of the low transaction speed. So I sold all my Bitcoin in late 2017. I made 5x my money. So I sold at like 10K. I thought I was a genius.
You sold to me because I bought at the end of 2017.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was your... You're welcome.
You're my exit liquidity.
You're my exit. I appreciate you being willing to sell to me at $27,500.
Of course, of course. But I sold, and then I just forgot. I kind of like forgot about it and just like moved on with my life. And at the time, I was studying finance and economics at university, and I was really diving down in my free time into macro. And so I got really down the gold bug path. And so that was my, I guess my focus. And I was just convinced that gold was going to be the next reserve currency. We're going to go back to a gold standard. And so I just forgot about it. But then in 2021, there was the GameStop squeeze. They turned off the buy button. That was one of the most, illuminating events for me that I've ever seen, where there's just blatant manipulation of a financial asset in front of your eyes. And I was like, this is insane. How can they do this? And then that led me down, starting to question, even more deeply philosophically, what is money? What is our financial system? Can gold really be the basis of it? And then I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't realize all these weak points in gold, and Bitcoin fulfills this perfectly. So I became a Bitcoiner, I'd say like mid 2021.
All right. So you were following Peter Schiff at that time, I guess, eh?
I was a huge Peter Schiff fan. Peter Schiff, Mike Maloney, those guys were like, gods to me. And I actually put my life savings in gold call options for gold miners, and it went to zero. So I lost everything in 2020.
Dang.
Yeah. It is a hard lesson to learn, but we all got to learn it.
A couple lessons there, right? Selling Bitcoin and then that. Okay, so tell us a little bit about GameStop. What's the story there? For those who don't even know what you're talking about, give us the background. Those of us who didn't watch the documentary on Netflix, Sure.
So GameStop, right, was a brick and mortar company that was starting to face declining sales. They were starting to burn cash, and for the latter part of the 2010s, they were starting to face serious financial difficulty. And a lot of hedge funds, especially once COVID-19 hit, a lot of hedge funds decided to group together to short this thing to oblivion, right? Because it made sense. Like, their company was bleeding cash. They had a $400 million bond due in March 2021. They had $75 million of cash. There was no way they were going to be able to pay it. So it was like, you can short this company, essentially bet on its failure, and in a year it's going to go bankrupt, and there's no one cares enough to save it. And so all these hedge funds entered and shorted this company even more than the float. So there was like, somewhere between 140% and 221% or even more short interest, like a massive amount. They shorted more shares than exist. And that brings up another problem with the settlement system. But Ryan Cohen comes in August 2020, and he buys 12% of the company. He becomes a board member, and then he becomes chairman of the board. And then he starts reshuffling the company, starts, bringing in a new CEO, bringing in a new CFO, bringing in all these Amazon people, and really making an investment in the long-term future of the company. And by January 2021, the stock starts going haywire, and retail really finds out about it in droves. There's the meme virality of Reddit and Twitter and all these other social media platforms that are now the future of, I guess you could call it like financial communication. And what that did is that it just drove retail investors in frenzy to GameStop, because they said, look, they've shorted this thing more than the float. The FINRA data in December 2020 was 221%. And so if they're shorting it more shares than exist, they can't get out of the short. And if you look at other short squeezes that were similar, like Volkswagen in 2008, it goes up like thousands of percent. So it's like for retail traders, it seemed like an easy way to just 10x your money and profit off some hedge fund stupid bet. And what ended up happening, obviously, is Melvin Capital and several other hedge funds start to go, like Loop Capital, start to go under due to this pain. Melvin Capital gets a bailout from Citadel to the tune of $2.3 billion. And by Thursday of the last week of January, right, more and more options had been added. Elon Musk had tweeted about it. The stock had gone absolutely parabolic. And on Thursday morning, January 28th, 2021, they shut off the buy button. And in those minutes, right before they shut off the buy button, there were fractional shares being sold for thousands of dollars a share. So like I saw examples on Reddit of people posting their Robinhood fractional share, certificates showing a sale like here's 0.3 of a share sold for $2,300.
Wow.
Here's another one, half a share for $5,200. So the settlement system, because of this massive retail wave of buying, options buying, and something called gamma hedging, as well as the short squeeze, was all, I guess, combining together to drive the stock into the stratosphere, just going parabolic, like up $10 every minute. And what that meant is obviously this was going to blow up some major hedge funds, and they couldn't let that happen. So the buy button gets shut off, and it gets shut off at the clearing broker side. So Apex Clearing is the clearing agent for all these brokers, and so they shut off buy button, which means all the brokers that deal with that clearing house can't operate, can't publish trades, can't buy, and so then they turn off buying for their customers. So it just leads to this cascade effect where the entire stock market just can't buy, right?
That's wild.
No retail investor can buy, and that's the most blatant example of manipulation that I've ever seen, right? What's the other time that you've seen that you can't buy a stock?
Yeah, I mean exactly. It's not been that blatant, that's for sure. So when you were watching this happen, were you trading this?
Yeah, I was trading it. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so when you see this happening, and you see the manipulation, connect the dots between that and Bitcoin as some kind of a solution to this problem.
Absolutely. So seeing that blatant manipulation in real time, and as well as the mainstream media come out and say like, hey, forget about GameStop. Like, this is a nothing burger. You should buy silver. You should buy, here's an ETF you should buy cost gaming. Like, all these like distractions that were thrown at us showed me that like not only do the banks and brokers have control over the settlement system, but they also have control over the financial media in the United States. And so that made me concerned, like, well, what else are they wrong about, right? And I'd read this book again from several years before about how Bitcoin was a nothing burger, doesn't have enough transaction throughput to actually be a reserve currency, and I had just dismissed Bitcoin. And so I thought, man, like, if they would lie this blatantly about GameStop, then they must be, and they're bearish on Bitcoin at the time. They must be wrong about this as well, or at least I should go check it out. And so I started researching Bitcoin, and the more I dove down that rabbit hole, reading Dirgigi, reading Saifedean's book, obviously, reading the actual block size wars, all these different authors, they showed me like, wow, this is the actual uncensorable, unscrew-withable, if we want to use a technical term, network, and it's the one that they can't turn the buy button off on. And so I thought, wow, this is revolutionary. I need to start investing in this. So that's why, May 2021, I just started going all into Bitcoin.
So what is the connection between the philosophy of Bitcoiners and kind of the failure in this kind of GameStop movement?
There's a lot of connections. I mean, the first is the system is broken, right? Something you hear from Bitcoiners all the time is that the fiat system is designed to rob you, right? And so we know that like the late interest charges at banks, just the general usage of usury and interest in general is like a slave mechanism, right? You borrow debt, you have to pay interest on it, on money that they create out of thin air, and then they can print more of that money to fund wars, to fund entitlement programs, infrastructure, whatever they want to do. They can just print the money for it. And so it begs the question, why are we even paying taxes, right? It makes everyone realize that the system by itself is broken. What the GameStop apes, for lack of a better word, realized was that the same problems that existed in just the traditional fiat system, like just banking, also existed in the stock market. So the DTCC, which is the central clearing authority for all, it basically manages all stock transactions in the United States, something like 97%. They have about $96 quadrillion worth of value traded through their doors every year, and they hold, 97, 98% of all stocks. So meaning like if I buy a stock and I own it, quote unquote own it, I actually own it through a broker, and that broker holds it at something called the DTCC, which is the central clearinghouse for the entire stock market. The DTCC is complicit in allowing these naked shorting and, stock shenanigans, market manipulation on a consistent basis, and it's been getting worse for the last 2 or 3 decades. Ever since they went digital in the late 90s, they went from paper certificates to purely digital. That transition actually started in the 70s, but they really ramped up in the 90s when they were finally able to get all the derivatives online and all the bespoke agreements. And so what it's meant is that the DTCC, they claim that they're a transparent organization, that they're beholden to the public, et cetera, but they're actually a private organization, just like the Fed. They're owned by corporations, and they have no incentive to fix this settlement problem, right? I mean, just think about it like logically. How can a stock be shorted more shares than exist? Shorting means I borrow the share and I sell it. So I borrowed more shares than exist and sold them into existence. This doesn't make any sense. But that happens with company after company, especially micro cap and small cap companies, and especially with companies that retail investors are buying. So we found out, for example, in the GameStop saga, that retail investors are 7 times more likely to receive a fail to deliver, which means, again, I buy a stock, let's say I buy Apple, and they basically do not give me the share. They just say, oh, we'll give you an IOU for the share, and in your brokerage account, it says you have shares. But when you actually go to the transfer agent to request the certificates, like I want to see this the certificate from the company. Here's the stock certificate of the exact stock I own. They're like, we don't have it. We don't know where it is. We'll have to go find it. And this happens across the stock market, across every security, but especially small companies, and especially companies that retail investors are buying. So 7 times more likely than an institution. Meaning if you buy a stock in the U.S., it's highly likely that, if you buy $1,000 worth of stock, probably 100, 200 of it is just fake. Right. Not real at all.
Wow. And so as you're experiencing some of these challenges with GameStop, how did you, hedge your bets against the traditional system into Bitcoin? What were you actively doing to separate yourself from this system?
I mean, the first thing was buying Bitcoin, right? Obviously. Like I just want to buy as much as possible. And then I started self-custodying it. And then I started realizing, not only do I want to get rid of all my, income that I have in fiat, I also want to get rid of fiat expenses. So I tried to do everything I can to reduce my budget, right? To be basically as cheap as possible in order to reduce my exposure to the fiat system.
And is that because you were trying to then just have more cash on hand to buy Bitcoin?
That was part of it. Yeah. But the goal overall was to move out of the system. And so what I did with the GameStop shares is I DRS them, which is something similar to self-custody for Bitcoin. You can take them out of the brokerage, out of the DTCC, and put them in a transfer agent, which holds it in your name. And then with the Bitcoin, obviously I self-custodied all of it. I was just like, I'm not trusting anybody.
Have you been able to live a life where you're spending your Bitcoin regularly on expenses?
Not super regularly. I would say maybe once every 2 weeks. I wish it was more. The problem is obviously we still have issues with Lightning integration, especially with retail businesses in the US. And there's just not enough, Bitcoiners yet using it on a daily basis to warrant a lot of these companies to adopt it. When I lived in Colombia, there's actually a lot of vendors that would accept Bitcoin. And obviously when I was in El Salvador as well, there's a ton of Bitcoin vendors.
Why were you living in Colombia?
I quit my job in 2023. I was working at a fintech, and I was writing macro content online, and it was starting to take off. So I just said, hey, why don't I go live somewhere else? And I went with another Bitcoiner, Ben Wehrman, if you know who that is. And we first wanted to go to El Salvador, but everyone told us Colombia was more fun. So we went checked it out.
Are you Colombian? But your name is the Peruvian Bull.
I'm half Peruvian. Yeah, my mom is Peruvian.
But you didn't go there.
No, I didn't. No,
okay, well,
I don't. I don't need to go somewhere where I've already been. It's not exciting.
And did you live in El Salvador?
I was there for almost a month. So okay. I don't know if you call that living there, but
I don't think we call that living.
No, I visited for a month. Yeah.
You visited for a month. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about kind of the meme culture. GameStop as a big meme culture. There's a dynamic community, online community with GameStop, and also a dynamic online community with Bitcoin. How important is that for the success of both of these movements?
It's highly important, right? Memes and humor is how we communicate nowadays. It's one of the universal methods of information gathering and sharing between people. And it's also one of the things that we use to find truth, right? When you see a comedic meme, you can it unites people because not only does it usually point out an obvious truth, but it also points out a lie that someone else is propagating, right? So GameStop apes will know. Like, I've put out tons of tweets about GameStop, tons of memes, but there's tons of them that show, like, here's something that they claim, and then here's the reality, and you just see, like, the clown and the Giga Chad meme. Like, it's so obvious when they're claiming, like, oh, we're not manipulating the stock, there's no problem, blah, 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 blah. And then they're like, the reality, it's 221% shorted. Like, how is that possible? Again, that shouldn't be theoretically possible in a stock market. And Bitcoin is the same thing, right? We have memes about the Fed printing money, like, oh, another war, let's just print some more money. And, you have sailors memes, obviously. Like, these things are not only information sharing mechanisms, but they're also ways that you build community, because you build an in-group. What happens is, like, those memes, there's I guess you call it like a subtle or a subconscious understanding of what the meme implies. Yeah. So, like, there's Awkward Greg, there's Giga Chad, right? There's the Soy Jacks, like, all those things imply something. And so when you put Gary Gensler and then put a Soy Jack meme next to him, everyone just kind of gets what the meme is getting, even if you can't even read the text. Yeah. So it creates community.
Yeah, and that community is important. Have you been able to establish or surround yourselves with in real life community in Bitcoin as well?
Yeah, I have. Yeah. So actually, I came back to Seattle in July of 2024. I was basically just working, and so I kind of ignored the Bitcoin community, but I also didn't really know it was big in Seattle. And then this year, I've started to go more towards the Bitcoin community, be more involved in the meetups and hangouts. I just did one this week.
Awesome.
With Swan, yeah.
Okay, so if we look at the speculation that we see right now with corporations purchasing and holding Bitcoin, which seems to be kind of a big narrative that we're experiencing right now with various different companies following the lead of strategy. And so what do we know about GameStop? And is it purchasing? Are they purchasing Bitcoin? Do they have plans? Where are we at there?
Sure. So GameStop, I mean, there's a longer story there, and I'll keep it brief for the sake of time. But GameStop raised, first they raised cash in 2021 to pay off that debt. So they didn't go bankrupt, right? Obviously. Then they spent several years turning the company around to make it actually cash flow positive and make sure that the stores weren't bleeding money and being EBITDA negative. So they made some major moves, firing a bunch of middle managers, getting rid of like 22% of storefront or overall store space. But by last summer, they had grown, net profit significantly, and then they started raising equity, and they had a bunch of cash, right? They had like $4.6 billion by the end of last summer in all these equity offerings. And so the question is, like, what are they going to do with this? And I was saying, look, they should buy Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is the perfect inflation hedge. It's uncensorable. It's better than gold, right? This is the actual future of the monetary system. It would make total sense if you unite these two communities, which already have distrust of one is the stock market and the other is the banking system, but obviously those are interrelated. If you combine those two communities, there'd be a powerful combination there. But GameStop has just been sitting on the cash. And so finally, January, February of this year, Ryan Cohen, the CEO of GameStop, met with Michael Saylor, and he posted a picture on Twitter, which went viral, obviously. Just him saying, like, I don't even think it was a quote, it's just
the picture.
Just a picture of them. And so everyone's like, oh, he's going to do it. So March, they filed a convertible note. They filled it on April 2nd. They filled a green shoe option, which meant they oversubscribed it to $1.5 billion. Net proceeds from that were $1.48. They made no announcement up until the Bitcoin conference. And then at the Bitcoin conference, they said that they'd bought 4,710 Bitcoin, which implies about $500 million worth of Bitcoin. So they didn't use the full note. And then just this week, so right before we came to talk yesterday, they filled another convertible note. They did 1.75 billion, and then about like 6 hours later, they announced it was oversubscribed to 2.25. So they're filling all these converts, and let's hope that they buy Bitcoin with it, but we don't know yet.
So they have would you say 1.25 in the second round?
So the second round of converts it's been filled up to 2.25 billion. An additional, a new convertible note at 2.25 billion, a senior note. Yeah.
Plus there's another billion that hasn't been spent yet.
Plus there's another billion that hasn't been spent yet. Yeah.
So we're at well over $3 billion.
Yes. And so again, we hope they use this money to buy Bitcoin, but if Ryan Cohen has another plan for an acquisition or other things, that might be on the table that's taking priority. But I can't think of a better use case for that money than buying Bitcoin.
And when you say the Bitcoin conference, you're referring to Bitcoin Las Vegas in May of this year, 2025.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's still a lot of cash on the table here for GameStop to potentially buy Bitcoin. And in the GameStop community, are there lots of advocates who are hoping that they buy, or what is the general sentiment that you understand?
Sure. So I was one of the main people, along with Ben Wehrman, who was pushing GameStop to buy Bitcoin. A lot of people thought I was crazy. A lot of people thought it was stupid, right? Because the problem is GameStop, before they went into Bitcoin, they were into NFTs. And they created a NFT marketplace using Loopring, which is like an ETH derivative, essentially. And they hired Robbie from Immutable X to basically run this whole thing. And it ended in a complete flop, right? They spent like $20 million. It made a few $1 million of revenue, and it was starting to grow in 2021. But once the NFT craze was over, the revenues flatlined and activity on the store flatlined, and they had to deprecate the whole platform.
Right.
So that just destroyed their credibility in that sense.
Yeah.
But the problem is the GameStop apes, they kind of follow whatever Ryan Cohen says. And so since Ryan Cohen had been so pro ETH in the past, they were all pro ETH. And so they were all kind of like altcoins, I should say. And so now finally with Ryan Cohen buying Bitcoin, they're starting to wake up and being like, whoa, what is this Bitcoin thing? What is this? But I'd say only about 20% of GameStop apes are actually Bitcoiners. The rest are not.
When you say that you and this other guy were the main voices behind pushing for Bitcoin, where is that happening? Is this on Reddit or is this on Twitter?
Twitter.
So you're tweeting about this regularly?
Yes.
Okay. And are people in the community responding to this on Twitter?
Yeah. And again, it's mixed. So some people, especially now that they did it, some people are like, yeah, finally, Ryan Cohen's making some good moves and buying some Bitcoin. But a lot of people are still, I'd say over 50% are still like, why is he doing this? This is stupid. Yeah. He's buying at the highs. He's buying at the wrong time. And I'm like, look, guys, that is correct. He's buying kind of late in the cycle, later than he should. But hindsight's 2020. I told him to buy at 50K and at 30K, and he didn't. Okay, so if they had followed my advice, then things would be much better. But they didn't. So this is where they are. But that's fine because we know that Bitcoin's going to go up, right? In the long run. So and they have so much cash on hand. They don't have anything to worry about. Yeah,
I mean, Michael Saylor says that he'll be buying the top forever. And he has, through this cycle, continually bought the top and seems pretty happy about it. And I think that all of us can look back to our Bitcoin buying journey where we bought, like I bought at the top in 2017, December of 2017. And I went from like whatever, 20,000, I can't remember what it was, $20,000 or something like that down to like 3,000 or 5,000. And I was like, man, what a stupid decision. And I didn't buy anything again until it started pumping. And I was like, we all experience that, right?
Yeah, it's human psychology.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the Bitcoin strategic reserve. You're an American. This is a big topic of conversation in your country and obviously has broad impacts globally. So what are your thoughts on a Bitcoin strategic reserve for the American government?
I think it's a brilliant idea. So one of my book that went viral initially on Reddit, and the reason why I even have any followers on there is because I wrote this thesis on Triffin's dilemma and how basically global reserve currencies work. And Triffin's dilemma is essentially this. In 1960, this Belgian economist goes in front of Congress and says, look, there's this problem with the global monetary system. The U.S. has external demand for its currency, and if the U.S. keeps supplying that demand, they'll print more dollars than are justified by Bretton Woods. So they'll break the currency system. And if they don't supply that currency, because again, it's the UK and Europe and Asia and Africa and all these countries that are starting to industrialize post-World War II, they all need liquidity. They all need the world reserve currency to trade and to borrow and to hold as reserves for their own foreign exchange reserves, right? If you don't supply that liquidity, then we'll see a global depression on a scale that we've never seen before because there won't be enough money flowing around in the system to facilitate trade. And so he's like, what do we do? This is the dilemma. And he presented it as a deflationary argument, but obviously we know that they went the inflationary route. They decided to print the money. And that is one of the key problems with all global reserve currencies, is that because they're a centrally issued unit, but there's global demand, they have to issue more currency than is justified by their own internal economy dynamics. So if it's the British pound, or if it's, the Spanish peso, or if it's the US dollar, whatever it is, they have to continually print more and more dollars to export abroad, more and more currency units to export abroad. And what that ends up causing as a side effect, and Lynn Alden talks about this, is you get trade deficits in the host country. And the reason why is because, again, think about trade. The other side of the transaction when I'm sending dollars is goods, right? So if I have a dollar export surplus, then I have a goods deficit. So meaning I have to run trade deficits all the time. Basically, I have to offshore my manufacturing, so I'm importing goods so that those dollars will continually flow out. Now, what that causes, again, is deindustrialization of the U.S. heartland, mass depression, mass drug overdoses and suicides, right? Just complete stripping of the middle class, especially in the Rust Belt states. Just a hollowing out of the industrial base in the United States, and that's not good. And what Bitcoin offers, and this is something I wrote about in one Substack piece back in November of 2023, is that Bitcoin is the first, potentially global reserve currency that is not centrally issued. And that means that it obviates the need for Triffin's dilemma. It bypasses the dilemma entirely. So you don't have to face this problem of, do I export my manufacturing base and destroy my heartland's, actual industrial prowess in order to fund the world? You don't have to do that because it's decentrally issued. Everyone can use Bitcoin. This miner over here will win a block reward. This miner over here will win a block reward, and they're not all the nodes and miners are in the U.S. So it solves it.
And so what is the sentiment right now in the United States outside of the Bitcoin community? Do people even know that this is a topic of conversation? Like when you're going to your local favorite cafe in Seattle at Pike Place Market or wherever you hang out, as you watch the salmon fly through the air and visit the gum wall, as you're staring at the Space Needle, what are people talking about when it comes to Bitcoin? Do people actually even know that this is a conversation?
There's a lot of Seattle references you had there.
I've been there.
I'm quite impressed.
I've been there.
Yeah. So unfortunately, again, I'd say that the average person is still pretty oblivious to this stuff. It's become more. I've seen more and more adoption, especially from people who are more on the fringes of Bitcoin. People who are maybe more like politically conservative or politically liberal, and they're already questioning parts of the system. So I'd say they're independent in that sense, but overall, the populace is still very slow to adopt, and that's what I expect for all technologies, right? The same was true with the internet.
I heard Lynn Alden, as you referenced her earlier, but I heard her say recently, there's still a lot of people that don't know anything about Bitcoin, and that's so encouraging because if everyone understood Bitcoin today, and it was only worth $100,000 per Bitcoin, we'd be wondering, well, that's too bad because people seem to get it and it's just not going anywhere. The fact that most people don't have any clue as to what Bitcoin is or its value proposition or whatever speaks to the potential opportunity in the future, especially for value increase or for speculation, right? Absolutely.
And you have to also consider this, right? Like only 1 or 2% of US companies are even talking about owning any Bitcoin. Microsoft just shot down a shareholder proposal to buy Bitcoin. Apple doesn't own any Bitcoin, right? Like most of the large cap or mega cap techs have zero interest and zero idea of even what this thing is and the revolutionary nature of the technology.
Here in Vancouver, we've seen our mayor Ken Sim present to City Council. He would like to purchase Bitcoin on the city's reserve, and he's been highly criticized for that here in British Columbia because people don't really, like in so many places, understand why that would be potentially a good thing. So this is obviously challenging. So what do you think is going to happen to change the narrative around these topics to actually see Bitcoin be purchased as a strategic reserve asset?
I think, and I've talked about this before in public spaces, I think you need to have, unfortunately, this is just how human psychology works, you need both the carrot and stick approach, meaning you can't just tell people, look, Bitcoin's going to go up in value, because that's not enough of a reason psychologically for most people to consider, either buying Bitcoin personally or supporting a candidate that would buy it for city treasury or a state treasury or a nation state treasury, right? So you need both the the Bitcoin price to rise and for the network effect of Bitcoin to start to really kick in, and you need the fiat system to continue to unwind, right? The inflation to get worse, the wages to fall, right? The industrial manufacturing output to continually fall, and the cost of living to rise, right? All these things need to continue to happen to push people out of the traditional fiat system that they're used to, that they've been indoctrinated into, and into Bitcoin. So I think you need both things happening simultaneously, unfortunately.
What was it like in El Salvador when you were there? Related to Bitcoin. I don't mean just the waves and the surf and the food, but what was it Bitcoin like?
It was pretty amazing. El Salvador is dollarized, so they're kind of on this path of moving towards harder money because obviously their own currency was very, very weak. But El Salvador saw this trend of Bitcoin adoption and overall investment in the space and the value that was being created, and so they decided to jump in head first. And my experience was that a good portion of businesses there, especially around the conference, were accepting Bitcoin as payment. Now the problem is there's still the issue of education, because again, when you're trying to educate a country of millions of people and they're starting from ground zero, and you're dealing with people all across the education range, all across the IQ range, right? It's hard to get all of them to grasp it at the same rate. Yeah. So there was definitely laggards. I had a couple taxi drivers who didn't have a way to buy accept Bitcoin for payment, but there were a couple that did. So I'd say it was still, it was like 30%, maybe 30, 40%, but that's still a huge improvement over the US or any other country.
When we look at government adoption for Treasury, what do you think are some of the biggest roadblocks that we see right now?
The biggest roadblocks are, well, for one, you have the I guess you call it like incipient or insidious roadblock that this means that the government itself would lose control over the monetary system, right? Having control of the money printer, as well as being able to block people from transacting like the U.S. can do with what's called SWIFT. Treasury has something called the OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Compliance, and they can force banks out of the SWIFT network or censor transactions, which means those banks can't process dollar payments. And since dollar payments are 65% of global payments overall, that basically can kill a bank overnight. So it would end up giving them giving up a huge lever of control. And so that I can see for governments is a very hard pill to swallow. Like they don't want to lose that ability. So that's one of the biggest ones. The other one is just governments are laggards in general when it comes to tech, when it comes to social movements, when it comes to everything. They're the slowest, oldest people on the block. And so for them to understand Bitcoin, even on a conceptual level, and get it, especially with our Congress in the United States, we have like, I don't know how many, 20, 30 Congress members, over 80 who are like being wheeled into, to Senate hearings. Like how do we expect these people who are 80 years old and literally born in the 1930s or 40s to be able to understand what Bitcoin is, much less, if they, an email or PDF or whatever else they can't do.
They're still trying to figure out how to e-sign a PDF.
Yeah.
They're still printing them and getting their fountain pen, their feather pen.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have a feather pen?
No, I don't. I don't.
Might be your next investment. What you should do is start a feather pen Bitcoin business.
Smart idea.
You don't have to support my dumb idea. You don't have to patronize me like that. So what do you think is going to happen here? We're sitting at $100 and some thousand Bitcoin, and the Israeli government invaded and bombed an Iranian nuclear facility last night, I guess, killed some military commanders. And we often see the sell-off of Bitcoin during these tumultuous times or these times of unknown. We didn't really see that big of a sell-off at this point yet. So, how do these things impact the future of Bitcoin when people are always like, oh, bad things are happening, I'm selling my Bitcoin? Because shouldn't it be the opposite?
Yeah, it should be. But I mean, this is, again, the knee-jerk reaction of markets, right? The problem is, again, if you're a hedge fund, if you're a family office, if you're just a retail trader, professional trader, you don't have access to markets 24/7. Equity markets are only open in the U.S. from 9 to 5, right? Bond markets are open for a certain time. Tokyo opens at different times. Everything's staggered. And so if you want to trade 24/7, crypto or Bitcoin, it's really the only thing to do. And since Bitcoin's the most liquid crypto, that's what everyone uses. So that knee-jerk response of Bitcoin selling off, that's one of the most incredibly, I think, asinine ways to view Bitcoin as like, oh, it's not actually a hedge of against inflation or a store of value because it sells off for 6 hours. It's
Right.
like, yeah, that's how trading works. People get scared, people liquidate their positions, and people on the margins, there's more buyers or more sellers than buyers for a few hours, and it retraces. But what you mentioned earlier, which is a really good point, is that, we're seeing this transition where on these bad news events, like, Israel bombing Iran, or, potentially claiming that they have a nuclear program that's active, Bitcoin is retracing less and less and less every single time. And then the grind up that happens afterwards is happening earlier and earlier and earlier. So that tells me that Bitcoin is not only, there's this talk of Bitcoin becoming a risk on or risk off asset. I did a panel about that last year at the Bitcoin conference. And my conclusion from that panel was that Bitcoin is moving not only from just a risk on to risk off, meaning like it's not only trading like a tech stock, it's going to soon trade like gold, which means it'll go up with bad events. Then it'll just be an asset, meaning it goes up no matter what. If there's bad news, great. That means they're going to print more money, and there's going to be more cash in the system to buy Bitcoin, and there's more inflation, so we're going to buy Bitcoin. There's good news, great. There's more money to buy Bitcoin. So either way, Bitcoin will just continually grind higher, and that's the transition we're seeing.
Can you just explain for the audience, what is a risk on asset and what's a risk off asset?
Sure. So risk on and risk off is a term in trading that refers to basically like an asset's, responsivity to events. So a risk on asset is something that you buy generally when markets are going up, when things are going well. These would be higher risk things like equities, options, futures, you could say crypto more broadly, right? Bitcoin. And then a risk off asset would be something like bonds, would become something like treasury tips, muni bonds, like cash. Raising cash that's the most risk off asset you can get, right? Because you're going into more defensive, safe assets, and since bonds generally are less volatile than stocks, that's what traders use to trade into. So they'll sell the risky asset, the stock, and they'll buy a safer asset like a treasury bond. And so you'll see yields fall, and you'll see stocks, yields fall, meaning bond prices rise, and stocks fall whenever there's a risk event.
So if there's like a potential of a war, people would say, well, we're going to try to remove some of our risk. So we're going to sell Bitcoin, or we're going to sell tech stocks. We're going to sell these kind of higher risk assets, and we're going to reduce our risk. And that means those are risk on assets.
Yes.
Okay.
And then the risk off assets are the things you move into. Those defensive assets, like cash.
Okay. That's great. Thank you. So as we see, it seems like these tumultuous activities happen more and more frequently, like now in the United States, I don't know, some people are freaking out in California for something, and these events are constantly happening. Do you see people who on both sides of the political spectrum in the United States saying, well, maybe we should get out of the system because the system seems to be broken? Or is this really just a libertarian right-wing thing?
No, I think Bitcoin spreads across the political spectrum. And one thing I always say, right, is Bitcoin doesn't have a political preference. Whether you're liberal or you're conservative, whether you're, hyper-authoritarian or hyper-libertarian, Bitcoin is just a monetary system. But the power of Bitcoin is its ability to strip centralized authority of their ability to rob the rest of us. And when you eliminate that system of grift, right, it means that these centralized authorities now no longer have this power lever that they can pull on the rest of us. They can't steal our value. They can't steal our life force. They can't steal our money by just printing more of it. So that means that overall it's a massive check on the power of centralized authorities, which I think both liberals and conservatives would agree on is a good thing, right? Although they'd point at different entities being the bad ones, right? The liberals might say it's, defense contractors and military spending, and the conservatives might say it's big pharma or it's the Democratic media establishment or whatever. Both of those entities just have too much power in the world right now. And so by adopting Bitcoin, it moves towards both values, I think.
Do you think that Donald Trump speaking positively about Bitcoin causes issues for liberals to accept Bitcoin?
That's a good question. There are obviously the liberals who are, I would call them like the never Trumpers, who are extremely opposed to anything that Trump does. Basically, it's that knee-jerk response of like, everything my guy does is perfect and everything your guy does is bad. right? Which is like an absolutist argument, which I think is ridiculous, right? There are some good things that Barack Obama did, right? And I didn't vote for him. There's some good things that Trump did, and I didn't vote for him his first term. So it's like, it's a more complex, nuanced world than those people who will write off Bitcoin just because Trump is positive about it.
Right.
There are that does exist, but
we kind of saw it with Tesla as well, right? Like Trump likes Tesla all of a sudden, and now people are embarrassed and ashamed to have a Tesla.
They're destroying. Well, it's because Elon partnered with Trump, as all these people, all these liberals are destroying and maiming Teslas in the U.S. as like a way to get back at Elon. It's insane.
Yeah, and I think some of the challenges that we see with this is that, okay, so I get it, maybe you don't like Tesla now, but like a couple of years ago, Elon was like the hero of the environmental movement. He was considered as, the guy who's most likely to save the planet from global climate change, and he was kind of our greatest candidate for, saving some of the problems we have. And he partners with Donald Trump and does some, some things that are off color or some things that people don't like, and now he's viewed and hated by the same group that so loved and supported him for so long. And it's amazing how fickle people can be. Oh, yeah. It doesn't take much, right, before they get upset and they're like, he's now the most evil person in the world, without maybe looking at, and I don't know a lot about Elon Musk or personally don't really care much about him, but it seemed like the group that most supported him flipped on him very quickly. And the reason I asked the question about politics around Donald Trump, it's like, well, when politicians, when these central authorities or these central figures support something, it seems like it causes problems for that thing. You know what I mean? In some ways, there's a portion of this of population that's just like, well, we will never like Bitcoin because it's just a conservative thing. And I see that maybe to be an enduring challenge that we have to overcome, because you're right, Bitcoin's neutral. It doesn't care how you vote. Bitcoin doesn't have a political opinion. And in fact, Bitcoin does a marvelous job at raising people out of poverty. It helps supporting marginalized groups. It helps bank, women in Afghanistan who can't participate in the economy. These are all liberal values and principles that, if liberals understood the importance of Bitcoin, would be, trying to accumulate as much as they could to support marginalized people.
Yeah. No, they'll come around to it eventually. Again, this is like, imagine a political candidate in, 9,000 BC is supporting fire. The other political candidate's like, I don't support fire because, we're not going to support fire because that guy, Krog, the ogre with a club, said that I like fire and I don't like that guy. Yeah. And it's like, look, if you want to be that dogmatic about your beliefs and just derive everything from, counter signaling what a single person says, you can do it. But Bitcoin's going to keep winning. And if you stay away from Bitcoin for that reason, which I think is, again, a very idiotic reason, then you're just going to end up on the losing end of the trade, right?
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so let's wrap things up. What do we see for Bitcoin in the next 3 years, 5 years?
3 to 5 years, we have a lot of interesting things happening. Again, we've moved past the early stages of initial retail adoption, and we're now into institutional adoption, Bitcoin Treasury, and then potential nation state adoption. I think the U.S., although they were obviously pointing towards a Bitcoin strategic reserve, or at least a strategic stockpile, the U.S. is going to be slow to adapt, because again, it's very hard for them to want to give up the lever of control. They want to be able to, utilize whatever financial strategy they do as effectively as possible, especially with regards to the debt. So, and then that also combined with just the laggard and slow nature of a government makes it hard for me to see the U.S. adopting it, within a year or so, but probably, 3 to 5 years as the debt problem continues to get worse, they'll finally have to acquiesce and start adopting. I think the Bitcoin Treasury strategy is going to start becoming a meme, a trend. And we're already seeing this obviously with GameStop adopting the strategy and buying 4,700 Bitcoin. But there's going to be more and more companies as Bitcoin price continues to grind higher and inflation continues to get worse. More and more companies are going to realize wow, we need to just buy some of this monetary network because it just continues to climb in value like clockwork, right? Yeah. So I think that trend's going to continue. And so, 3 to 5 years, I could see Bitcoin price being, around $1 million. And I could see most major corporations having it as a store of value.
That's great. Roberto, tell us, where can we learn more about you and what you do?
Sure. So I have a Twitter account, and it's at Peruvian_Bull. Again, I used to be under this pseudonym Peruvian Bull, but I've gone public recently with my real name. I also have a Substack, which has both a free and a paid version for people who want to learn more about macro or economics. And I have a YouTube channel as well, also under Peruvian_Bull. And the Substack is called Dollar Endgame.
Dollar Endgame. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much for being with me here today. I thought it was a great conversation.
Sweet. Thanks so much. I appreciate it, Jared.